The Winchester rifle felt cold against Eleanor Fletcher's palm as she stood at the edge of Gila City's only saloon, watching couples spin and twirl inside through the dusty window, their laughter carrying into the Arizona night like music she could never quite understand. It was June of 1878, and the mining town buzzed with celebration after a particularly prosperous strike in the nearby hills. But Eleanor felt as distant from the revelry as the stars overhead seemed from the parched earth below. She had arrived in Gila City 3 weeks prior, fleeing an arranged marriage her father had orchestrated back in Philadelphia. And though she had managed to secure work as a seamstress for Mrs. Patterson's dress shop, the weight of loneliness pressed against her chest like an iron brand. She turned away from the window, her dark hair catching the lamplight spilling from the saloon's entrance, and nearly collided with a tall figure stepping out into the night. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her before she could stumble backward into the hitching post. "Careful there, miss," a deep voice said, and Eleanor found herself looking up into the weathered face of a man who appeared to be in his late 20s, with sun-darkened skin that spoke of endless days under the Arizona sun, and eyes the color of desert sage. He wore a simple cotton shirt, worn denims, and a leather vest that had seen better years, but there was something solid about him, something that reminded her of the mountains she had glimpsed on her journey west. "I apologize," Eleanor said, stepping back and smoothing her simple calico dress. "I was not watching where I was standing." The man tipped his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that needed cutting. "No harm done. Name's Xavier Thornton. I run a cattle ranch about 5 miles north of here." "Eleanor Fletcher," she replied, offering her hand in what she knew was perhaps too forward a gesture for this rough territory, but Philadelphia manners died hard. Xavier shook her hand, his grip firm but gentle, calloused palm speaking of hard work and honest labor. "You are new to Gila City. I would remember seeing you before. I arrived from the east 3 weeks ago." Eleanor withdrew her hand, suddenly aware of how small hers felt in his. "I work for Mrs. Patterson, the seamstress shop." Xavier nodded, then glanced back toward the saloon where music had struck up again, a lively tune that set boots stomping and hands clapping. "You are not joining the celebration." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, grateful for the darkness that might hide her embarrassment. "I do not dance, Mr. Thornton. I never learned properly, and I fear I would only make a fool of myself." Something softened in Xavier's expression, an understanding that seemed too deep for such a simple confession. "Dancing is not about being proper, Miss Fletcher. It is about feeling the music and letting yourself move with it." "That is easy for you to say," Eleanor said, surprised by the slight edge in her voice. "I imagine you grew up learning such things naturally." Xavier let out a low chuckle that held no mockery. "I grew up learning how to rope cattle and mend fences. My mother died when I was 8, and my father was not much for teaching social graces. Everything I know about dancing I learned from watching and making a fool of myself plenty of times." The honesty in his words caught Eleanor off guard. She had expected empty reassurances, not this raw admission that somehow made her feel less alone in her inadequacy. "Then, why do you attend these gatherings?" "Because sometimes it is good to be around people, even if you do not quite fit in." Xavier shifted his weight, and Eleanor noticed he favored his left leg slightly. "And because Mrs. Patterson's apple pie is worth braving the crowd." Despite herself, Eleanor smiled. "She does make exceptional pie." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of celebration washing over them like waves against a distant shore. Inside the saloon, someone called for a partner change, and the dancers shuffled and reformed like pieces of a living puzzle. "May I walk you home, Miss Fletcher?" Xavier asked suddenly. Gila City is mostly safe, but there are always a few minors who celebrate too enthusiastically. Eleanor knew she should refuse, knew that accepting such an offer from a stranger could damage her already precarious reputation in this small town. But something about Xavier Thornton felt trustworthy, and the thought of walking alone through the dark streets held less appeal than it had minutes before. "I would appreciate that," she said. They walked slowly through Gila City's main street, past the general store with its darkened windows and the assay office where fortunes were measured in gold dust and silver ore. The town had grown haphazardly, buildings thrown up with more enthusiasm than planning, but in the moonlight it possessed a strange beauty that Eleanor was only beginning to appreciate. "How did you come to own a ranch?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. "You seem young to have such an enterprise." "I am 27, Xavier said. "And the ranch was my father's before me. He died 2 years ago from a fever that swept through these parts. It is not much, just a few hundred acres and maybe 200 head of cattle, but it is mine." "Well, mine and the bank's until I finish paying off the loan my father took out before he passed." The burden in his words was palpable, and Eleanor felt a kinship with this quiet rancher who carried responsibilities too heavy for his years. That must be difficult, managing it alone. "I have 3 ranch hands who help, good men who have been with my family for years. But yes, it is difficult sometimes." Xavier paused at a corner, waiting for a wagon to pass before continuing. "What brought you to Arizona, if you do not mind my asking? It is a hard land for someone from the East." Eleanor hesitated, unused to speaking freely about her circumstances. In Philadelphia, everything was proper and contained, emotions locked behind social niceties and carefully maintained facades. But here, under the vast Arizona sky with this straightforward man beside her, she found the truth easier to speak than she had expected. "I was running from a marriage my father arranged," she said quietly. "To a man twice my age who saw me as nothing more than a decoration for his home and a bearer of his children. I am 22 years old, Mr. Thornton, and I wanted the chance to choose my own path, even if that path led me to a dusty mining town in the middle of nowhere." Xavier was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor, worried she had said too much, revealed herself as the rebellious daughter polite society would condemn. But when he spoke, his voice held only respect. That took courage, more courage than most people possess. He gestured toward a small house at the end of the street, where Eleanor rented a room from a widow named Mrs. Copper. "Arizona is hard, but it is also free in ways the East never can be. Out here, what you do matters more than who your family is or what society expects." They stopped in front of Mrs. Copper's house, and Eleanor turned to face Xavier, suddenly reluctant to end this unexpected conversation. "Thank you for walking me home, Mr. Thornton, and for understanding about the dancing." Xavier smiled, and in that expression Eleanor saw warmth that made her chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. "Call me Xavier, please, and Miss Fletcher, if you ever want to learn to dance, really learn without judgment or pressure, my offer stands. I may not be the most graceful partner, but I promise not to laugh if you step on my toes." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm again, and she wondered if this blushing would ever cease. "I will consider that, Xavier, and please call me Eleanor." "Good night, Eleanor." He tipped his hat once more and turned to leave, his limp more pronounced now after the walk. "Xavier," Eleanor called before she could stop herself. He turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "How did you hurt your leg?" "Horse threw me when I was 16, he said matter-of-factly. "Broke in 3 places and did not set quite right. Does not slow me down much, just reminds me to pay attention to what I am doing." Eleanor nodded, filing away this information with everything else she had learned about this unexpected man. "Good night, Xavier." She watched him disappear into the darkness before entering the house, her mind whirling with thoughts she could not quite organize. Mrs. Copper sat in the front room, mending by lamplight, and looked up with knowing eyes. "That was Xavier Thornton walking you home," the older woman said, not quite making it a question. "He was being gentlemanly," Eleanor replied, removing her shawl and hanging it on the peg by the door. "Xavier is a good man," Mrs. Copper said, returning to her mending. "Lost his father young, been carrying that ranch on his shoulders ever since. Half the single women in Gila City have set their caps at him, but he keeps to himself mostly." Eleanor felt an inexplicable flutter of something that might have been jealousy, which was ridiculous considering she had just met the man. "I am sure he has his reasons. I am sure he does." Mrs. Copper's needle flashed in the lamplight. "But he walked you home, which is more than he has done for any of those other women." Eleanor bid the widow good night and retreated to her small room, but sleep came slowly, her thoughts returning again and again to sage-colored eyes and a voice that spoke of understanding and patience. The next morning arrived with the relentless heat that characterized Arizona summers, and Eleanor walked to Mrs. Patterson's dress shop with the sun already beating down mercilessly. The shop occupied a narrow building between the general store and a lawyer's office, its front window displaying 2 dresses that Eleanor had finished just the previous week. "Good morning, dear Mrs. Patterson called from the back room where she was sorting through bolts of fabric that had arrived on the morning stage. "We have 3 new orders today. Mrs. Hendricks wants a dress for her daughter's wedding, and the Cartwright sisters both need new Sunday dresses." Eleanor set to work, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of measuring, cutting, and stitching. She had always possessed a talent for sewing, one of the few ladylike accomplishments her mother had insisted upon that Eleanor actually enjoyed. Here in Gila City, that talent meant independence, meant not having to rely on anyone else for survival. The shop door opened around mid-morning, bringing with it a gust of hot air and a woman Eleanor had not met before. She was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair piled elegantly on her head, and a green dress that was far too fine for Gila City's dusty streets. "I need a dress altered," the woman announced without preamble, her voice carrying the affected accent of someone trying to sound more refined than they were. "I am Caroline Murphy, and I manage the saloon." Mrs. Patterson emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course, Miss Murphy. Eleanor, would you take Miss Murphy's measurements and see what can be done?" Eleanor set aside the dress she had been hemming and retrieved her measuring tape, trying to ignore the way Caroline Murphy studied her with sharp, assessing eyes. "You are new," Caroline said as Eleanor measured her waist. "From back east, I hear." "Philadelphia," Eleanor confirmed, jotting down the measurement. "And what brings a Philadelphia girl to Gila City? Running from something or running towards something?" The question was too personal, too probing, but Eleanor kept her voice level. "Looking for something different." Caroline laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Are not we all? Though I imagine different means different things to different people." She paused, then added with studied casualness, "I saw Xavier Thornton walking you home last night." Eleanor's hand stilled for just a moment before she continued measuring. "He was being kind." "Xavier is always kind," Caroline said, and something in her tone made Eleanor look up. "It is one of his more frustrating qualities. A man like that should not be wasting his life on a failing ranch when he could do so much better." "His ranch is failing?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. Caroline's smile was sharp. "Not failing yet, but close enough. Drought has been hard on the ranchers, and Xavier refuses to sell to the mining companies even though they have made him generous offers. Stubborn man, clinging to his father's legacy like it means something. Mrs. Patterson returned then, and the conversation shifted to the specifics of the alteration. But Caroline's words lingered in Eleanor's mind, adding new dimensions to her understanding of the quiet rancher who had walked her home. 3 days passed before Eleanor saw Xavier again. She had just closed the shop for the evening and was walking toward Mrs. Copper's house when she heard her name called. Xavier stood beside a wagon loaded with supplies from the general store, his hat pushed back and sweat staining his shirt despite the late hour. "Eleanor," he said again, his face lighting up in a way that made her pulse quicken. "I was hoping I might run into you, Xavier." She walked over to the wagon, noting the bags of grain and coils of rope, the mundane supplies of ranch life. Stocking up always seems to be something needed. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "I was wondering if you might like to take that dancing lesson I mentioned. Not tonight," he added quickly, seeing her hesitation. "But perhaps Sunday afternoon. I could ride into town after church services and we could find a quiet place to practice." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from the inevitable embarrassment of her clumsy feet and complete lack of rhythm. But something in Xavier's expression stopped her, a hopefulness that seemed fragile and precious. "I will make a terrible student," she warned. "Then we will be well matched because I am a terrible teacher." Xavier's grin was boyish and utterly charming. "Say yes, Eleanor. What is the worst that could happen? I could step on your feet until you cannot walk. My feet have survived worse, I promise you." Despite herself, Eleanor smiled. "Sunday afternoon, then, but I am holding you to your promise not to laugh. Not even a little bit, not even a little bit." Xavier's laugh was warm and genuine, drawing curious glances from people passing by. "It is a deal. I will meet you at Mrs. Copper's house around 2 o'clock. Eleanor nodded, already second-guessing her decision but unable to take it back without seeming rude. They talked for a few more minutes about inconsequential things, the weather and the town gossip, before Xavier needed to start his journey back to the ranch before full darkness fell. Sunday arrived with agonizing slowness, and Eleanor found herself changing her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue cotton that was pretty without being too fancy. Mrs. Copper watched her preparations with barely concealed amusement. "Just a dancing lesson," the widow said, her tone suggesting she believed otherwise. "Just a dancing lesson," Eleanor confirmed, though her nervous hands betrayed her. Xavier arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, riding a sturdy brown mare and leading a second horse, a gentle-looking gray with kind eyes. "I thought you might like to ride out to my ranch," he said after greeting her. "There is more space there and more privacy, unless you would prefer to stay in town." The thought of attempting to dance where Caroline Murphy, or any number of curious townspeople, might observe held no appeal. "The ranch sounds perfect." Xavier helped her mount the gray horse with patient instruction, and they rode north out of Gila City into the open desert landscape. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, but a slight breeze made the heat bearable. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. "There," Xavier said eventually, pointing toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. "That is home." The ranch sprawled across a shallow valley with a main house built of adobe and timber, a large barn, several outbuildings, and corrals where cattle grazed on sparse grass. It was not grand or impressive, but there was something solid about it, something that spoke of generations of hard work and stubborn perseverance. "It is beautiful," Eleanor said, meaning it. Xavier looked surprised as if he had expected criticism or disappointment. It is rough living compared to Philadelphia. Philadelphia was never truly home, Eleanor replied. It was just where I lived. They rode into the ranch yard, and two men emerged from the barn, both Mexican and both eyeing Eleanor with friendly curiosity. Xavier introduced them as Miguel and Carlos, brothers who had worked for his father and now worked for him. A third man, older and weathered like ancient leather, was introduced as Sam, who had apparently taught Xavier everything he knew about cattle. "The boss is finally bringing a lady home," Sam said with a gap-toothed grin. "We were starting to worry he had forgotten what one looked like." "Sam," Xavier said warningly, but there was affection in his tone. "We are just here for a dancing lesson," Eleanor clarified, feeling her cheeks heat up yet again. The three ranch hands exchanged knowing looks but said nothing more, disappearing back into the barn with barely suppressed grins. Xavier shook his head ruefully and helped Eleanor dismount. "Ignore them. They think they are funnier than they actually are." He led her toward the house. "Would you like something to drink before we start? It is a hot afternoon." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly neat for a bachelor's home, with simple furniture and whitewashed walls that kept the space cool. Xavier brought her water from a clay pitcher, and they sat at a wooden table that showed signs of many meals and much use. "I should tell you that I really have no idea how to teach someone to dance," Xavier admitted. "I just know how to do it myself, more or less. Then we are truly in trouble." But Eleanor felt more relaxed here, away from the judgmental eyes of the town, in this honest space that felt lived in and real. They moved outside to a cleared area near the house where hard-packed earth created a natural floor. Xavier positioned Eleanor facing him, taking one of her hands in his and placing his other hand gently on her waist. Even through the fabric of her dress, she could feel the warmth of his palm, and her breath caught at the unexpected intimacy of the position. "The basic step is simple," Xavier said, his voice lower now, more focused. "I step forward with my left foot, you step back with your right. Then I bring my right foot forward, you bring your left foot back. Then we step together with both feet. That is it, just those 3 movements over and over." "That does not sound too complicated," Eleanor said, though her heart hammered in her chest for reasons that had nothing to do with fear of dancing. "The trick is doing it to music and not thinking about it too much." Xavier hummed a simple tune, something slow and waltz-like, and began to move. Eleanor immediately stepped on his foot. "Sorry," she gasped, trying to pull back, but Xavier held her steady. "You are thinking too much. Do not watch your feet, watch me." His sage-colored eyes held hers, and Eleanor found herself caught in that gaze, unable to look away. "Trust me to guide you." That is what leading is about, not controlling but guiding. They tried again, and this time Eleanor managed 3 steps before stumbling. Xavier caught her easily, his strength evident but never overwhelming, always controlled and careful. "I warned you I was terrible at this," Eleanor said, frustration creeping into her voice. "You have been dancing for all of 2 minutes. Give yourself some time." Xavier repositioned them and started humming again, the same simple melody. They practiced for over an hour, and gradually Eleanor began to feel the rhythm instead of just hearing it. Her steps became less hesitant, more fluid, and though she still occasionally trampled Xavier's feet, the movement started to connect into something that almost resembled dancing. "There," Xavier said, his voice warm with approval. "You are dancing, Eleanor. Do you feel it?" She did feel it. The way their bodies moved together, the push and pull of lead and follow, the strange intimacy of being held this way by someone who was still nearly a stranger yet felt increasingly familiar. The sun painted the desert gold around them, and in that moment, Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, something that had been locked tight for so long she had forgotten it existed. They finally stopped as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, both breathing harder from the exertion and the heat. Eleanor's dress clung to her back with perspiration, and strands of hair had escaped her careful bun, but she felt more alive than she had in months. "You are a better dancer than you think," Xavier said, releasing her reluctantly, "and I am a better teacher than I feared. I still stepped on your feet at least a dozen times. Only 11. I was counting." His grin was teasing, and Eleanor found herself laughing, really laughing, in a way she had not done since leaving Philadelphia. Miguel appeared from the barn, calling something in Spanish that made Xavier nod. "The men are about to start dinner. Would you like to stay and eat with us? It will be simple fare, but there is always plenty." Eleanor knew she should decline, knew that staying would fuel gossip and speculation, but she found she did not care. "I would like that very much." Dinner was served at a long table outside, under a ramada that provided shade and caught the evening breeze. The food was indeed simple: beans and rice and fresh tortillas that Carlos's wife Rosa had made that morning, but it was delicious in the way food tastes when shared with good company. The ranch hands teased Xavier mercilessly about his dancing, and Eleanor found herself relaxed and comfortable in a way that would have been impossible at any Philadelphia dinner party. "The boss is different when you are around," Miguel said to Eleanor when Xavier had gone to fetch more water. "Lighter somehow." "I think you are imagining things," Eleanor replied, but the words pleased her more than she wanted to admit. The ride back to Gila City happened in the gentle darkness of early evening, with stars beginning to appear overhead like scattered diamonds. Xavier rode close beside her, pointing out constellations and telling her stories about the ranch and his childhood, about his mother who had loved this harsh land despite its difficulties, and his father who had built everything from nothing. "You miss them," Eleanor said softly. "Every day." Xavier's voice was rough with emotion. "But I think they would be proud of what I am trying to do, keeping the ranch going despite everything working against it. Caroline Murphy said the mining companies want to buy your land." Xavier was quiet for a moment. "Caroline talks too much about things that are not her business. Yes, they want the land. There is copper in the hills and they are willing to pay well for the rights to mine it. But this is my family's legacy, Eleanor. I cannot just sell it off to the highest bidder. Even if keeping it means losing it anyway." The question was blunt, perhaps too blunt, but Eleanor had never learned to soften her words the way society expected. Xavier did not seem offended, though, just thoughtful. "Maybe I am a fool, holding on to something that is slipping through my fingers no matter what I do. The drought makes it hard to keep cattle fed and watered. Prices are down because every rancher in the territory is trying to sell stock they cannot maintain. And the bank is patient, but not infinitely so." He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "But at least I am failing on my own terms." They reached Mrs. Copper's house too soon, and Xavier helped Eleanor dismount, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," Eleanor said, looking up into his face, shadows and moonlight creating planes and angles that made him seem both familiar and mysterious. "I have not enjoyed myself so much in a very long time." "Neither have I." Xavier's hand came up as if he might touch her face, but he caught himself and dropped it back to his side. "Eleanor, I know we have only known each other for a short time, but I would like to see you again. Not just for dancing lessons, but just to see you, if that would be acceptable to you." Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I would like that too, Xavier, very much." His smile could have lit the entire territory. "Then I will come into town next Sunday, and perhaps we could take a walk together, somewhere with fewer curious eyes." "That sounds perfect." They stood there for another moment, neither quite wanting to break the spell of the evening before Eleanor finally forced herself to step back. "Good night, Xavier." "Good night, Eleanor." She watched him ride away, his figure gradually disappearing into the darkness, before turning to find Mrs. Copper waiting in the doorway with a knowing expression. "Do not say a word," Eleanor warned, but she could not keep the smile from her face. "I was not planning to say anything," Mrs. Copper replied, far too innocently. "Except perhaps that Xavier Thornton is a good man, and you could do far worse." Eleanor could not argue with that assessment. The following days passed in a strange, suspended state, where Eleanor moved through her work at the dress shop, but found her thoughts continually drifting north to a ranch in the desert, and the man who lived there. She had received letters from her father, forwarded through a contact in Tucson, demanding she return home and fulfill her duty to the family. She had burned them without responding, knowing that nothing she could say would change his mind or make him understand her need for freedom. "You seem distracted," Mrs. Patterson observed on Thursday afternoon as Eleanor had to unpick a seam she had sewn crooked. "Is everything all right?" "Just thinking," Eleanor replied vaguely. "About a certain rancher, perhaps?" The older woman's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Half the town saw him ride out with you last Sunday, and the gossip has been running wild ever since." Eleanor set down her needle with more force than necessary. "Is there nothing else for people to talk about in this town?" "Not much, dear. We take our entertainment where we find it." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. "But truly, Xavier is a good man. He has had a hard time of it, losing his parents so young and taking on so much responsibility. He deserves some happiness." "We have only just met," Eleanor protested. "Everyone is making far too much of a simple friendship." "If you say so." But Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she believed otherwise. Saturday evening, as Eleanor was preparing for bed, she heard shouting from the direction of the saloon. This was not unusual in Gila City, where miners with money in their pockets and whiskey in their bellies often created disturbances, but something about the commotion made her uneasy. She looked out her window to see several men on horseback riding through the street, their faces shadowed by their hats, moving with purpose toward the north edge of town. The next morning, Xavier did not arrive at 2 o'clock as promised. By 3, Eleanor was pacing Mrs. Copper's front room, worry gnawing at her stomach. By 4, she had convinced herself that something was terribly wrong. "Maybe he just got delayed with ranch work," Mrs. Copper suggested, but even she looked concerned. At 5 o'clock, Miguel arrived on a lathered horse, his face grim. "Miss Fletcher, you need to come with me. There has been trouble at the ranch." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "What kind of trouble? Is Xavier hurt?" "Just come, please. The boss is asking for you." Eleanor did not hesitate, did not stop to think about propriety or what people might say. She climbed onto the horse behind Miguel, and they rode hard through the desert as the sun began its descent, painting everything in shades of red and gold that seemed ominous rather than beautiful. The ranch looked different from her previous visit, marked now by an air of violence and violation. Several sections of fence had been torn down, and as they rode closer, Eleanor could see the barn door hanging crooked on its hinges. Miguel led her toward the house, where Xavier sat on the front step with a bloodied cloth pressed to his forehead. Eleanor slid off the horse before it had fully stopped and rushed to Xavier's side. "What happened? Are you all right?" "I am fine," Xavier said, though the cut on his head suggested otherwise. "Just a little banged up." Sam emerged from the house with fresh water and clean cloth. "Some men came last night, wearing masks and making threats. Told the boss he had 1 month to accept the mining company's offer, or things would get worse. They tore down the fences and scattered the cattle," Carlos added, appearing from around the side of the house. Took us all morning to round them up again, and we are still missing about 20 head. Eleanor knelt beside Xavier, taking the cloth from his hand and gently cleaning the blood from his face. The cut was not deep but would bruise badly. Did you recognize any of them? They kept their faces covered, but I have my suspicions. Xavier's jaw was tight with barely contained anger. The mining companies have been getting more aggressive lately, trying to force out the smaller ranchers so they can consolidate land. You need to report this to the sheriff. Sheriff Dawson is on the mining company's payroll or close enough. He will write a report and file it away and do nothing else. Xavier caught her hand, stilling her movements. Eleanor, you should not have come out here. It is not safe. Miguel said you were asking for me. Xavier shot a dark look at his ranch hand, who suddenly found something very interesting to study in the distance. I was worried that you would hear about the trouble and be concerned. I was planning to ride into town tomorrow to let you know I was all right and apologize for missing our walk. Well, I am here now, and I am not leaving until I know you are properly tended to. Eleanor's voice was firm in a way that brooked no argument. Do you have medical supplies? Rosa, who had arrived with Carlos, nodded and disappeared into the house, returning with a battered box containing bandages and a bottle of whiskey. Eleanor cleaned Xavier's cut more thoroughly, ignoring his winces, and bandaged it properly. You have done this before, Xavier observed. My mother volunteered at a hospital in Philadelphia. I used to go with her sometimes. Eleanor sat back on her heels, studying her work. That should hold, but you need to keep it clean. Yes, madam. Xavier's tone was teasing, but his eyes were serious. Eleanor, I need you to understand something. These men are not playing games. They will come back, and next time they might do more than just tear down some fences. I cannot ask you to be part of this, cannot risk you getting caught up in something dangerous. Eleanor felt her spine stiffen. You are not asking me anything, Xavier Thornton. I am choosing to be here, choosing to care about what happens to you. If you think I am going to run away at the first sign of trouble, then you do not know me at all. Something fierce and bright flared in Xavier's eyes. Eleanor Fletcher, you are the most stubborn woman I have ever met. Good. Because you are the most stubborn man I have ever met, and somebody needs to match you. The tension broke, and Xavier laughed despite the circumstances. Fair enough. But I am still riding you back to town before it gets full dark. No arguments. This time Eleanor did not protest, recognizing the worry beneath his authoritative tone. They rode together on his horse, Xavier's arms around her as he handled the reins, and Eleanor found herself leaning back against his chest, taking comfort in his solid presence. Are you really going to keep fighting them? She asked quietly as Gila City's lights appeared in the distance. Even if it means losing everything. Xavier was silent for a long moment. I do not know any more. A week ago, the answer would have been yes without hesitation. But now, thinking about what I might be risking, about what else I might lose beyond just land and cattle, I am not so certain. Eleanor understood he was talking about more than just the ranch, and the knowledge made her heart race. They had known each other for such a short time, but something had grown between them that felt both fragile and incredibly strong, like a desert plant that somehow thrived in impossible conditions. Whatever you decide, Xavier, it should be your decision. Not made because of threats or pressure, but because it is what you truly want. And what do you want, Eleanor? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and possibilities. Eleanor took a breath and spoke the truth that had been growing in her heart since that first night outside the saloon. I want you to be safe, and I want the chance to see where this goes, whatever this is between us. Xavier's arms tightened around her, and she felt him press his face briefly against her hair. I want that too, more than I can properly express. They reached Mrs. Copper's house too soon and too late, the evening having progressed into full night. Xavier helped Eleanor dismount and walked her to the door, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I will be careful," he promised, "and I will come see you in a few days once things settle down. You better." Eleanor squeezed his hand, then did something that would have scandalized her Philadelphia relatives. She rose on her toes and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek, right beside the bandage she had applied. "Good night, Xavier." She slipped inside before he could respond, before she could see his reaction, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Through the window, she watched him stand there for a moment, one hand coming up to touch the place she had kissed, before he climbed back on his horse and rode away. "That man is in love with you," Mrs. Copper said from her chair, making Eleanor jump. "We barely know each other." Sometimes that is all it takes, knowing enough to recognize something real. The widow set aside her mending. "The question is, are you in love with him?" Eleanor had been taught that love was something that grew slowly over time, cultivated through proper courtship and rational assessment of compatibility. But standing in Mrs. Copper's front room with her lips still tingling from the brief touch of Xavier's skin, she wondered if perhaps everything she had been taught was wrong. "I think I might be," she admitted, the words feeling like both a confession and a revelation. The next 2 weeks were some of the strangest of Eleanor's life. Xavier came into town twice more, and each time they walked together through Gila City's outskirts, talking about everything and nothing, learning the contours of each other's minds and hearts. They discussed Eleanor's childhood in Philadelphia, her mother's death 3 years prior, her father's increasingly tyrannical control over her life. Xavier spoke about his loneliness after his father's passing, the burden of responsibility he had not felt ready to carry, his dreams for the ranch that seemed to slip further away with each passing season. They also talked about lighter things, discovering shared appreciation for storytelling and horses, debating the merits of different types of pie with an intensity that made them both laugh. Eleanor found herself falling deeper with each conversation, each moment of Xavier's quiet humor and steady strength, each time his hand found hers as they walked and held on like he never wanted to let go. The mining company made no further moves against the ranch, but the threat hung over everything like a thundercloud waiting to break. Xavier grew increasingly tense, though he tried to hide it when he was with Eleanor. She could see it in the tight set of his shoulders, the way his gaze would drift toward the northern horizon as if expecting to see trouble riding toward them. On a particularly hot Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor was working in the dress shop when Caroline Murphy entered, her expression sharp and predatory. "I need to speak with you," Caroline said without preamble. "About Xavier." Eleanor set down the dress she had been hemming, meeting the other woman's gaze steadily. "What about Xavier? You need to stop seeing him. You are giving him false hope, making him think he has something worth fighting for when he should be accepting reality and selling that failing ranch." Anger flared hot in Eleanor's chest. "That is not your decision to make, Miss Murphy, or mine for that matter. It is Xavier's choice and his alone. You have been here all of 5 minutes and you think you understand the situation." Caroline leaned against the counter, her posture deceptively casual. "Xavier is too stubborn for his own good. He will hold onto that ranch until it drags him under completely, until he loses everything including his pride. The best thing you could do for him is walk away, stop being a distraction." "The best thing I can do is support his decisions, whatever they may be." Eleanor stood, drawing herself up to her full height, which was still several inches shorter than Caroline. "Why do you care so much what Xavier does with his land?" Something flickered across Caroline's face, too quick to identify. Because I have known Xavier for years, and I hate watching him destroy himself over a piece of dirt that is not worth the sacrifice. Or perhaps because someone is paying you to encourage him to sell. Eleanor kept her voice level, but the accusation hung in the air between them. Caroline's expression hardened. Be careful, Miss Fletcher. You are making assumptions about things you do not understand. Then help me understand. Who benefits from Xavier selling his land besides the mining company? Everyone benefits when progress comes to the territory. The mine will bring jobs, money, growth. Xavier's ranch brings nothing but dust and stubborn pride. That ranch is his family's legacy, his home. That means something. Sentiment does not pay bills or put food on the table. Caroline pushed away from the counter. I am trying to help you both, even if you are too foolish to see it. But fine, have it your way. Just do not say I did not warn you when everything falls apart. She swept out of the shop, leaving Eleanor shaking with anger and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like fear. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the back room where she had been listening. That woman has always been trouble, the older woman said. And I would not be surprised if you are right about someone paying her. The mining companies have been trying every angle to get the land they want. What can we do? Nothing. But Xavier might be able to do something if he knew what was really going on. Mrs. Patterson paused, considering. The company representative is staying at the hotel, a man named Blackwell. Maybe someone should find out exactly what kind of deals he is making around town. Eleanor spent the rest of the day considering this information, her mind working through possibilities and plans. By the time she closed the shop that evening, she had made a decision that probably qualified as either brave or foolish, possibly both. She walked to the hotel, a two-story building that was the nicest accommodation Gila City offered, and asked the clerk which room belonged to Mr. Blackwell. The young man looked uncertain, but Eleanor fixed him with her most imperious Philadelphia stare until he stammered out, "Room 7, second floor." Eleanor climbed the stairs with more confidence than she felt and knocked firmly on the door. A voice called for her to enter, and she stepped into a room thick with cigar smoke and the smell of expensive whiskey. The man behind the desk was perhaps 50, with silver-threaded dark hair and the kind of face that suggested wealth and power. He looked up from his papers with raised eyebrows. "Miss Fletcher, I presume I have heard about you." His voice was smooth, educated, dangerous. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? I want to know what you are doing to Xavier Thornton." Blackwell leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at his lips. "I am not doing anything to Mr. Thornton, except making him a generous offer for property he can barely afford to maintain. That is called business, not persecution. I know about the men who attacked his ranch, the threats that were made. Those were unfortunate events, certainly, but nothing to do with my company. These territories can be lawless places. All sorts of unsavory characters roam about." His tone suggested he did not believe his own words and did not care if she believed them either. Eleanor felt her temper rise but forced herself to remain calm. "Xavier will not sell to you. Everyone sells eventually, Miss Fletcher. It is just a matter of finding the right pressure point." Blackwell picked up his cigar, regarding her through the smoke. "The question is, are you going to be that pressure point, or are you going to be an obstacle that needs to be removed?" The implied threat made Eleanor's skin crawl, but she refused to show fear. "I am neither. I am simply someone who cares about Xavier and will stand by whatever decision he makes." "How romantic!" Blackwell's smile widened, becoming something unpleasant. "But romance does not pay debts or save failing ranches. In 6 weeks, Mr. Thornton's loan payment comes due at the bank. Unless he has suddenly discovered a hidden fortune, he will not be able to make that payment. The bank will foreclose, and we will buy the property at auction for a fraction of what we are offering him now. So you see, time is working in my favor." Eleanor felt cold despite the evening heat. Xavier never mentioned a loan payment. Of course he did not. Men like Xavier Thornton, they think they can handle everything alone, that admitting difficulty is somehow shameful. It is almost admirable, really, if it were not so utterly foolish. "How much does he owe?" Blackwell named a figure that made Eleanor's stomach drop. It was not a fortune by Philadelphia standards, but in Gila City, it might as well have been all the gold in California. "Now you understand the reality of the situation," Blackwell continued, clearly enjoying himself. "So I suggest you use whatever feminine wiles you possess to convince Mr. Thornton to accept our offer while it still stands. Otherwise, he loses everything and gets nothing in return. Or you could give him more time. Extend the loan terms. I do not control the bank, Miss Fletcher. Though I imagine they might be persuaded to extend the terms if Mr. Thornton agreed to sell the mining rights to his land. We could lease the surface rights back to him. Let him keep his precious cattle ranch while we extract what is actually valuable beneath it." It sounded reasonable, almost generous, but Eleanor did not trust the man or his smooth words. "I will tell Xavier about this conversation." "Please do. Maybe you will succeed where I have failed in making him see reason." Blackwell dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Good evening, Miss Fletcher. Enjoy the rest of your time in Gila City, however long that may be." The implied threat followed Eleanor out of the room and down the stairs, making her look over her shoulder multiple times as she hurried back to Mrs. Copper's house. She needed to tell Xavier what she had learned, needed to warn him about how much worse things were than he had admitted. The next morning, Eleanor convinced Mrs. Patterson to give her the day off, claiming she was not feeling well. Instead of resting, she borrowed Mrs. Copper's horse, a placid mare named Daisy, and rode north toward Xavier's ranch. The journey took longer than it had with Miguel or Xavier, as Daisy preferred a sedate walk to any faster pace, but Eleanor eventually arrived at the ranch in late morning. Xavier emerged from the barn as she dismounted, surprise and pleasure warring on his face. "Eleanor, what are you doing here? Is everything all right? I need to talk to you about your loan payment." The pleasure drained from Xavier's expression, replaced by something guarded and uncomfortable. "How did you hear about that?" "I spoke with Mr. Blackwell from the mining company." Eleanor followed Xavier as he turned and walked toward the house, his limp more pronounced than usual, suggesting his leg was bothering him. "Xavier, why did you not tell me how serious the situation was?" "Because it is my problem, not yours." Xavier's voice was tight. "I should not have let you get involved in any of this. You should be focusing on building your own life here, not worrying about my troubles." "That is not how caring about someone works, Xavier. You do not get to decide what I worry about or what concerns me." They reached the house, and Xavier finally turned to face her, his expression conflicted. "Eleanor, in 6 weeks I might lose everything. The ranch, the house, all of it. What kind of man would I be to drag you into that kind of uncertainty? The kind of man worth standing beside." Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his sage-colored eyes, close enough to watch his throat work as he swallowed hard. "Blackwell said the company might be willing to lease back the surface rights if you sell them the mining rights. You could keep the ranch and get enough money to pay off the loan. Keep the ranch while they tear apart the hills looking for copper, polluting the water and scarring the land. That is not keeping the ranch, Eleanor. That is watching it die slowly instead of all at once." "Then what are you going to do?" Xavier turned away, bracing his hands against the porch railing and staring out at the land that meant everything to him. I do not know. I have been trying to figure that out for months, and I am no closer to an answer. Every option feels like a betrayal, either of my father's memory or of my own principles, or of the future I want to build. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his on the railing. What future do you want to build, Xavier? He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in a gesture that felt both tender and desperate. A month ago, I would have said a future where this ranch thrives and honors my family's legacy. But now, I find myself imagining a different future, one that includes you, and I do not know how to reconcile those two visions when one might require sacrificing the other. Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest. Xavier, are you saying what I think you are saying? I am saying that I am in love with you, Eleanor Fletcher. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other for a few weeks, but I cannot deny what I feel any more than I can deny that the sun rises in the east. You have become as essential to me as breathing, and the thought of losing you is worse than the thought of losing this land. Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes, tears of joy and fear and overwhelming emotion. I love you too. I have been falling in love with you since that first night when you walked me home and understood about the dancing without making me feel foolish. Xavier turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. Then help me figure this out. I do not want to make this decision alone anymore. They went inside and sat at the kitchen table, spreading out papers that detailed Xavier's financial situation. It was worse than Eleanor had imagined, the loan payment due being only the most immediate crisis in a cascade of debts and obligations. Even selling the cattle would not generate enough money quickly enough, and the drought had made the herd worth less than half its value from 2 years prior. What about the land itself? Eleanor asked, studying the property deed. How much of it is grazing land versus the hills where the copper deposits are? Maybe a third of the property is hill country, too rough for cattle but apparently rich in copper ore. The rest is valley and grazing land. Xavier traced the property lines on the map he had retrieved from a drawer. Why? Could you sell just the mining rights to the hills, keep the rest of the property outright? Not a lease but an actual partition of the land. Xavier frowned, considering. I do not know if the mining company would agree to that. They want control of the whole property. But it is worth asking, is it not? Especially if the alternative is losing everything at auction. Eleanor studied the numbers again. If you could get even half of what they are offering for the full property, just for the mining rights to the hills, it would be enough to pay off the loan and give you breathing room to rebuild. My father would never have sold even an inch of this land. Your father lived in different times with different challenges. Xavier, honoring his memory does not mean making the same choices he would have made. It means carrying forward the spirit of what he built, adapting and surviving so that there is something left to pass on. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he wrestled with the decision. Finally, he nodded slowly. You are right. I cannot let pride or stubbornness destroy everything when there might be another way. I will talk to Blackwell, see if he is willing to negotiate. They spent the rest of the day going over the details, planning arguments and counterarguments, preparing for the negotiation that could determine Xavier's future, and increasingly, their shared future. By the time Eleanor needed to start back to Gila City, the sun was lowering toward the horizon, painting the ranch in shades of amber and gold. Let me ride back with you, Xavier said. I do not like the idea of you traveling alone, especially with everything that has been happening. They rode together, Xavier on his mare and Eleanor on the borrowed Daisy, talking about possibilities and plans, about dreams that seemed both fragile and achingly real. As Gila City came into view, Xavier slowed his horse and reached over to catch Eleanor's hand. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "All right," she said, though her heart had begun to race with nervous anticipation. "If I manage to work this out, if I can keep the ranch and build something stable, would you consider staying in Gila City? Not just staying, but staying with me." He took a breath, his next words coming out in a rush. "I know I should probably wait, should court you properly for months and do everything the right way, but I cannot help feeling like we are running out of time. So I am asking, Eleanor Fletcher, if I can keep my ranch, would you marry me?" Eleanor's vision blurred with tears, and for a moment she could not speak past the lump in her throat. When she finally found her voice, it came out shaky but sure. "Yes, Xavier. Yes, I will marry you." Xavier's whoop of joy startled both horses, and then he was dismounting and pulling Eleanor down into his arms, spinning her around despite his bad leg, kissing her with a passion that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor could not stop smiling. "We might be completely insane," she said, her hand still gripping his shoulders. "Probably," Xavier agreed, pressing his forehead against hers. "But I would rather be insane with you than sensible alone." They stood there in the growing darkness, holding each other, until propriety and approaching full night forced them to continue into town. Xavier walked Eleanor to Mrs. Copper's door, stealing one more quick kiss before letting her go. "I will talk to Blackwell tomorrow," he promised. "And then, if he agrees to negotiate, I will talk to you about wedding plans." Eleanor watched him ride away, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Inside, Mrs. Copper took one look at her face and smiled. "He proposed," the widow said with satisfaction. "He proposed," Eleanor confirmed, "and I said yes." The next day dragged endlessly as Eleanor waited for news from Xavier. She stabbed herself with her needle twice, so distracted that Mrs. Patterson finally sent her to the back room to sort buttons, a task that required less dangerous focus. It was nearly closing time when Xavier finally appeared, his expression carefully neutral. "Walk with me," he asked, and Eleanor's heart plummeted, certain that he was about to deliver bad news. They walked in silence to the edge of town, to a small rise that overlooked the desert stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Xavier took both of Eleanor's hands in his, and she braced herself for disappointment. "Blackwell agreed to my terms," Xavier said, and Eleanor's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Not easily and not without a lot of arguing, but he agreed. I am selling the mining rights to the hill country, keeping the rest of the ranch outright. The payment will be enough to clear the bank loan with money left over to invest in improvements. I will have to accept that my land will be scarred by mining operations, but the ranch itself can continue." "Xavier, that is wonderful." Eleanor threw her arms around his neck, and he lifted her off her feet, both of them laughing with relief and joy. "There is more," Xavier said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her waist. "I told Blackwell that I needed the payment immediately, that I could not wait for lengthy contract negotiations. He is having his lawyer draw up the papers now, and we should be able to finalize everything within 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Eleanor repeated, the timeline suddenly making everything feel startlingly real and immediate. "Which means, if you are still willing, we could be married by the end of the month." Xavier's hands tightened on her waist. "Eleanor, I know this is fast. I know we are probably doing everything backward and wrong by society's standards, but I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Will you really marry me, knowing that life on a ranch is hard work and uncertain income, and probably nothing like what you grew up with in Philadelphia?" Eleanor thought about her life in Philadelphia, about the suffocating expectations and the loveless marriage her father had arranged, about the emptiness she had felt even in the midst of wealth and comfort. Then she looked at Xavier, at his honest face and steady eyes, at the man who had taught her to dance and made her laugh and respected her strength. "I will marry you," she said firmly. "Not despite the hard work and uncertainty, but because of who you are and what we could build together. I did not come west looking for an easy life, Xavier. I came looking for a real life, and I have found it with you." They sealed the promise with a kiss that felt like a beginning, like the first page of a story they would write together. When they finally walked back to town hand in hand, Eleanor felt like she was floating, tethered to earth only by Xavier's solid presence beside her. The news of their engagement spread through Gila City with the speed of wildfire, generating reactions that ranged from genuine happiness to barely concealed skepticism. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Copper were delighted, immediately beginning to plan wedding arrangements despite Eleanor's protests that she wanted something simple. The ranch hands greeted the news with enthusiastic approval. Miguel claiming he had known from the first moment, Xavier brought Eleanor to the ranch that she was special. Caroline Murphy said nothing, but her silence felt pointed and judgmental. Eleanor ignored her, too happy to let anything dim her joy. The contract with the mining company was finalized 12 days later, with Xavier walking out of the lawyer's office looking like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He paid off the bank loan that same afternoon, the bank manager looking vaguely disappointed to lose his leverage over the ranch. "It is really done," Xavier said that evening as he and Eleanor sat on Mrs. Copper's front porch, watching the sun set in shades of orange and purple. "The ranch is secure, at least for now. I can breathe again. And now we can focus on the wedding," Eleanor said, leaning against his shoulder. "About that." Xavier shifted to face her, suddenly looking nervous. "I do not have much to offer you, Eleanor. The ranch house is small and needs work. I cannot give you fancy dresses or servants or any of the things you grew up with." Eleanor pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping the words. "Xavier Thornton, I left all of that behind for a reason. What I want is a partner, someone who respects me and challenges me and loves me for who I am, not who society thinks I should be. Everything else is just details." "I can give you that," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "I can give you all of that and more." They were married 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon in late August when the heat had finally broken, and the evenings carried hints of the autumn to come. The ceremony took place at the small church in Gila City, with Father Martinez officiating and half the town in attendance. Eleanor wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, white cotton with blue embroidery at the collar and cuffs, and carried wildflowers that Rosa had gathered from the hills. Xavier wore his best shirt and a new vest that Miguel had helped him pick out, and when Eleanor walked down the aisle on Mrs. Copper's arm, the look on his face made her eyes sting with happy tears. The ceremony was brief, the words traditional, but when Xavier said, "I do," and slipped a simple gold band on her finger, Eleanor felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. "You may kiss your bride," Father Martinez said with a smile, and Xavier needed no further encouragement. The kiss was chaste by necessity, given their audience, but it held promise and passion and the beginning of everything they would become to each other. When they broke apart, the church erupted in applause and cheering. The celebration afterward took place at the ranch, with tables set up under the stars and food that everyone in attendance had contributed to. There was music, guitars and fiddles and enthusiastic singing, and as the evening progressed, someone called for the bride and groom to dance. Eleanor felt her old nervousness return, aware of everyone watching, but Xavier just smiled and held out his hand. "Trust me," he said, just as he had during their first lesson. They moved together into the cleared space that served as a dance floor, and Xavier pulled her into the familiar position they had practiced. Someone started playing a slow waltz, and Xavier began to lead her through the steps they had worked on together. "I am still going to step on your feet," Eleanor whispered. "I know," Xavier replied, his eyes warm and full of love. "But I also know you will keep trying, keep learning, keep getting better. That is all any of us can do, just keep moving forward together." They danced, and Eleanor stumbled twice but recovered with Xavier's steady guidance. Around them, other couples joined in, filling the space with movement and laughter. When the song ended, Xavier pulled Eleanor close and whispered in her ear. "I cannot dance perfectly," he said, "but I can lead you through life instead. Through the good days and the hard days, through the certainties and the uncertainties. That is my promise to you, Eleanor Thornton. I will always be here to guide you, and you will always be here to steady me." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. "That is all I ever wanted, Xavier. Someone to walk beside me, not in front of me or behind me, but beside me." They kissed again, and this time Eleanor did not care who was watching or what anyone thought. This was her life, her choice, her love, and it was more real and true than anything she had known in her carefully orchestrated Philadelphia existence. The party continued late into the night, but eventually the guests began to depart, offering congratulations and ribald advice that made Eleanor blush and Xavier laugh. Finally, they were alone except for the ranch hands, who discreetly vanished into the bunkhouse, leaving the newlyweds to their privacy. Xavier led Eleanor into the house, their house now, and showed her the bedroom he had spent the past week preparing. It was simple but clean, with fresh whitewashed walls and a sturdy bed covered in a quilt that Rosa had made as a wedding gift. Wildflowers in a clay vase sat on the small table by the window, and curtains Eleanor had sewn herself hung to either side. "It is not much," Xavier said, "but it is ours." "It is perfect," Eleanor replied, meaning it with her whole heart. Their wedding night was tender and awkward and perfect in its imperfection. Two people learning each other in the most intimate way possible, discovering how to move together in this new dance. Xavier was patient and gentle, and Eleanor found courage she had not known she possessed, meeting him as an equal partner just as they had promised each other they would be. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Xavier's arm around her and her head on his chest, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had fled Philadelphia certain that she was running away from something, but she had actually been running toward this, toward the life and love she had not known she was seeking. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, his voice a rumble under her ear. "That I am exactly where I am supposed to be." His arm tightened around her. "Me too." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other as the desert night settled over the ranch and the future stretched out before them full of promise and possibility. The first months of their marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery. Eleanor learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings and physical labor, the constant maintenance that land and animals required. She learned to ride better, to rope cattle with Miguel's patient instruction, to read the weather signs that Xavier watched so carefully. She learned which chores she enjoyed, like tending the vegetable garden Rosa helped her plant, and which she merely tolerated, like mucking out the barn. Xavier learned about Eleanor's strength and capabilities, watching with pride as she took on challenges he had expected might overwhelm her. She never complained about the hard work or the isolation, though he knew she sometimes missed the cultural opportunities of Philadelphia, the libraries and theaters and concerts. To compensate, he ordered books from the catalog that came through the general store, and they spent evenings reading aloud to each other, sharing stories and ideas in the lamplight. They learned each other's bodies and needs, growing more confident and comfortable in their physical intimacy. Eleanor discovered that Xavier was ticklish behind his left knee, and that he loved having his hair stroked when he was tired. Xavier learned that Eleanor hummed while she sewed, and that she woke up grumpy, unless allowed to come to consciousness slowly with coffee and quiet. They also learned to fight and make up, discovering that disagreements did not mean the end of love, but rather its deepening. Eleanor hated Xavier's tendency to take on too much alone without asking for help. Xavier found Eleanor's impulsiveness simultaneously endearing and terrifying, especially when it led her to attempt things like breaking a half-wild horse without proper supervision. But they learned to talk through their frustrations, to compromise and forgive, to choose their battles, and let go of the small irritations that could poison a relationship if allowed to fester. The mining operations in the hills began in October, bringing noise and disruption, and a constant stream of workers passing through the ranch. Xavier hated it, Eleanor could tell, hated the scarring of land that had been pristine, hated the pollution starting to show up in some of the streams. But he also recognized the necessity of the sacrifice, the way it had saved everything else he held dear. "We adapt," he said one evening as they watched the sunset from their porch. "We do what we must to survive and protect what matters most." "What matters most?" Eleanor asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "You," Xavier said simply, pulling her close. "You and whatever life we build together. The land is important, but you are essential." That winter brought cold nights and occasional snow, rare in southern Arizona but not unheard of. Eleanor learned to appreciate the fireplace Xavier kept well stoked, and the warmth of being curled against her husband under heavy blankets. She also learned she was pregnant, a discovery that filled her with equal parts joy and terror. "I do not know how to be a mother," she confessed to Xavier, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "And I do not know how to be a father," Xavier replied, covering her hand with his. "But we will learn together, just like we have learned everything else." The pregnancy progressed through winter into spring, with Eleanor experiencing relatively mild symptoms, despite dire warnings from the older women in Gila City. She continued working as long as she was able, finally stopping only in the last month when her balance became too precarious for safety around the animals and equipment. Their son was born on a warm April evening in 1879, after a labor that lasted 10 hours and left Eleanor exhausted, but exhilarated. Xavier stayed with her throughout, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, emerging from the experience looking nearly as wrung out as his wife. They named him Thomas, after Xavier's father, and he had Eleanor's dark hair and Xavier's sage-colored eyes. Xavier held his son with a tenderness that made Eleanor's heart ache, this strong man reduced to awe by 8 pounds of squalling infant. "He is perfect," Xavier said, tracing Thomas's tiny features with one finger. "He is loud," Eleanor replied, but she was smiling as she said it, already exhausted by love for this small creature they had created together. The first year of Thomas's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant demands, but also moments of transcendent joy. Eleanor had never imagined she could feel so much love or such bone-deep exhaustion. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, taking late-night shifts with the baby so Eleanor could sleep, learning to change diapers and make bottles with the same patient determination he brought to everything. The ranch continued to operate, helped enormously by the buffer the mining payment had provided. Xavier was able to hire an additional ranch hand, a young man named Daniel who was eager to learn the cattle business. The herd grew slowly but steadily, and by Thomas's first birthday, the ranch was turning a modest profit for the first time in years. Gila City grew too, swelling with miners and the businesses that supported them. The town gained a proper school, a second saloon, and even a small hotel that was nicer than the previous establishment. Eleanor sometimes missed the quiet isolation of their early days, but she also appreciated having more resources available and more opportunities for Thomas as he grew. Caroline Murphy left Gila City abruptly. Some said because her relationship with the mining company had become a liability once their more aggressive tactics came to light. Eleanor felt no particular satisfaction in the woman's departure, just relief that one source of tension had been removed from their lives. By Thomas's second birthday, Eleanor was pregnant again, this time with a daughter they would name Grace. She arrived in the fall of 1881, an easier birth than her brother had been, and she had Xavier's sandy brown hair and Eleanor's dark eyes. Xavier was equally besotted with his daughter, and Thomas proved to be a gentle and interested older brother once he got over his initial jealousy at having to share attention. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their growing family and the steady rhythm of ranch life. They added a third child, another son they named William, in 1884. The children brought chaos and joy in equal measure, filling the house with laughter and noise and constant activity. Eleanor sometimes looked at her life and marveled at how different it was from everything she had been raised to expect. Her hands were calloused, and her skin sun-browned. She wore simple dresses she made herself and spent her days cooking and cleaning and helping with ranch work when she could. But she was happy in a way she had never been in Philadelphia, satisfied in a deep place she had not known existed. Xavier thrived too, growing into his role as husband and father and rancher. The worry lines that had creased his face when Eleanor first met him gradually smoothed as the ranch stabilized and grew. He never became wealthy, but they had enough, and that was all they needed. One evening in the summer of 1889, 11 years after that first meeting outside the saloon, Eleanor and Xavier sat on their porch watching their 3 children play in the yard. Thomas was 10 now, tall and serious like his father. Grace was nearly 8, full of laughter and mischief. William was 5, still small but already showing signs of his father's determination. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked, his hand finding Eleanor's as it always did. "Giving up your old life, ending up here instead?" Eleanor considered the question, looking at the life they had built together, at the children they had raised and the home they had created. She thought about the scared young woman who had fled Philadelphia, certain only that she could not accept the future being forced upon her. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, it is everything I never knew I wanted and exactly what I needed." Xavier lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles in a gesture that had become habit over the years. "I love you, Eleanor Thornton. Thank you for taking a chance on a struggling rancher who could not offer you anything but hard work and an uncertain future." "You offered me everything that mattered," Eleanor replied. "A partnership, respect, love, and the chance to choose my own path. That is worth more than all the wealth and security in the world." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The mine was still operating, would probably continue for years more, but Xavier had learned to accept its presence as the price of keeping everything else. The cattle grazed peacefully in the valley, and the garden Eleanor had expanded over the years provided fresh vegetables. The house had been enlarged to accommodate their growing family, and there were plans for further improvements as finances allowed. Thomas called out that dinner was ready, and the family gathered around the table that had once been too large and now felt almost too small. They held hands as Xavier said grace, thanking God for the food and the family and the life they shared. Eleanor looked around at the faces she loved most in the world and felt her heart swell with gratitude. After dinner, Xavier taught Thomas and William some basic rope tricks while Eleanor and Grace cleaned up, talking about Grace's ambitions to become a teacher. Music drifted from someone's ranch in the distance, carried on the evening breeze, and Eleanor felt Xavier's eyes find hers across the yard. He walked over to where she stood and held out his hand, just as he had that first night and during their first dancing lesson and on their wedding day. "Dance with me." "I still cannot dance," Eleanor protested, but she was already taking his hand, already letting him pull her into the familiar position. "You can dance just fine," Xavier replied, beginning to lead her through the basic steps they had practiced so many times over the years. "You just needed someone to show you how." They moved together in the twilight, their steps sure and familiar now, refined by years of practice and patience. The children stopped what they were doing to watch, Grace clapping along to a rhythm only she could hear, and Thomas shaking his head at his parents' silliness, while William tried to copy their movements with exaggerated steps that made everyone laugh. "I love you," Xavier said, the words simple but weighted with 11 years of shared life and deep devotion. "I love you too," Eleanor replied, resting her head against his chest and letting him lead her through the steps, through the dance, through their life together. They danced until the stars came out, until the children grew bored and went back to their games, until the music in the distance faded to silence. But even after the dancing ended, Xavier kept Eleanor in his arms, swaying gently in the darkness. "You remember what I said on our wedding day?" Xavier asked. "About leading you through life. I remember everything from that day. I meant it, every word, but I think I understand now that it was not really about leading or following. It was about moving together, about finding our rhythm and trusting each other enough to let go and just feel the music." Eleanor lifted her head to look at him, this man who had become her whole world, who had shown her that strength could be gentle and that true partnership meant being willing to both lead and follow depending on what the moment required. "You taught me to dance, Xavier Thornton, in every sense of the word. And you taught me that holding on too tightly to the past means missing out on the future, that sometimes adapting and changing is not betrayal but survival." Xavier cupped her face in his hands, his touch as gentle as it had been the first time. "We have built something good here, Eleanor, something worth whatever sacrifices we made to achieve it." "We have," Eleanor agreed, knowing it was true in the deepest part of her soul. They stood there under the vast Arizona sky, wrapped in each other's arms as the desert night settled around them, and their children's laughter echoed from somewhere in the darkness. The ranch was quiet except for the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and the whisper of wind through the scrub grass. It was not the life Eleanor had been born to, but it was the life she had chosen, had fought for, had built with her own hands and heart alongside the man she loved. "Come on," Xavier said eventually, taking her hand and leading her toward the house. "Let us get the children ready for bed and then maybe sit outside a while longer, just the two of us." They gathered Thomas, Grace, and William, shepherding them through the bedtime routine with practiced efficiency. Stories were read, prayers were said, foreheads were kissed, and finally the house settled into the peaceful quiet of sleeping children. Xavier and Eleanor returned to the porch, sitting close together on the bench Xavier had built their second year of marriage. The stars blazed overhead, so many and so bright they seemed almost within reach. An owl called somewhere in the darkness, and far away, a coyote answered. "Do you think they will stay?" Eleanor asked, gesturing toward the house where their children slept. "Thomas and Grace and William, do you think they will want the ranch, or will they seek their own paths like we did?" "I do not know," Xavier admitted. "But whatever they choose, I hope we have given them the freedom to choose and the courage to pursue what makes them happy. That is all we can really do as parents, give them roots and wings both." "You are becoming a philosopher in your old age," Eleanor teased, though Xavier was only 38 and hardly old by any measure. "Living with you has made me think about things I never considered before." Xavier's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You challenged everything I thought I knew about how life should be lived, and I am better for it." They sat until the night grew cold, talking about their plans and dreams, about the children's futures and the ranch's prospects, about nothing and everything. Finally, they retreated inside to their bedroom, to the bed they had shared for 11 years, and held each other in the darkness. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, not quite sure what she was thanking him for, but needing to say it anyway. "For what?" "For seeing me that night outside the saloon. For walking me home. For offering to teach me to dance. For being patient and kind and honest. For loving me enough to let me be myself." Eleanor paused, her throat tight with emotion. "For giving me this life." Xavier's arms tightened around her. "Eleanor, you gave yourself this life. You were brave enough to leave everything you knew and start over somewhere completely foreign. You worked hard and adapted and never gave up even when things were difficult. I just had the incredible good fortune to be the man you chose to build that life with." "We chose each other," Eleanor corrected. "And we keep choosing each other every single day. That is what makes it work." "That is what makes it work," Xavier agreed. They fell asleep as they always did, tangled together, Eleanor's head on Xavier's chest and his hand in her hair. Outside, the desert night continued its ancient rhythms. And inside, the ranch house held the family they had created, the life they had built, the love they had discovered and nurtured and grown into something strong enough to weather any storm. Years continued to pass, bringing more changes and challenges. The mining operation eventually played out, leaving scarred hills that would take decades to heal, but also leaving Xavier and Eleanor's ranch intact and thriving. Thomas did choose to stay on the ranch, taking over more and more of the daily operations as Xavier's bad leg worsened with age. Grace became a teacher as she had dreamed, working in the Gila City School and eventually marrying a lawyer who had moved to town from Denver. William showed an aptitude for business and became the ranch's primary negotiator for cattle sales, driving their profits higher than they had ever been. Eleanor and Xavier grew old together, their hair going gray and their bodies slowing, but their love never diminishing. They added a room onto the house for when the children and eventual grandchildren came to visit. And the dinner table, Xavier had worried, was too small, became the gathering place for 3 generations. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1908, their children threw them a party that brought together everyone who had been part of their journey. Mrs. Cooper had passed away years before, but Mrs. Patterson was still alive and attended with her family. Miguel and Carlos were still working the ranch, now teaching Thomas's own children the skills they had once taught Thomas. Sam had died in his sleep 5 years prior, but his presence was felt in all the ways Xavier ran the ranch according to the principles the old cowboy had taught him. After the party, after the guests had left and the children had returned to their own homes, Eleanor and Xavier sat on their porch in the spot that had become their favorite place to watch the world. Xavier's leg was stiff and painful these days, but Eleanor's hand in his made everything bearable. 30 years, Xavier said wonderingly. It seemed like forever when we started, and now it feels like it passed in the blink of an eye. The best years of my life, Eleanor replied, meaning it absolutely. She was 52 years old now, her face lined and her hands rough from decades of work, but she had never felt more beautiful or more complete. If I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a single thing, not even my terrible dancing instruction. Eleanor laughed, the sound warm and full of joy. Especially not that. That was where everything started, where you showed me that it was okay to be imperfect, that trying was more important than succeeding. You taught me to trust, Xavier, both you and myself. That was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. Xavier lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day and every day since. You taught me that holding on is not the same as staying strong, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is adapt and change and let go of what no longer serves you. You saved my ranch, Eleanor, and more importantly, you saved me from a life of lonely stubbornness and rigid pride. We saved each other, Eleanor said, leaning against his shoulder and looking out at the land they had fought to keep, the legacy they were passing on to their children and grandchildren. That is what love does. It saves us from the worst versions of ourselves and helps us become the best versions instead. They sat in peaceful silence as the sun set behind the hills that were finally beginning to heal from the mining scars, painting everything in shades of gold and rose. The cattle grazed in the valley, their numbers strong and healthy. The house behind them held decades of memories, joys and sorrows, triumphs and failures, all woven together into the fabric of a life well lived. "Dance with me one more time," Xavier said, standing carefully and offering his hand in the gesture that had become their signature. Eleanor took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, even though both of them moved more slowly now, even though his leg made him unsteady, and her joints ached from long years of hard work. They moved together in the twilight, their steps familiar and sure despite their aging bodies, refined by 3 decades of practice and unwavering devotion. "I still cannot dance perfectly," Eleanor said, echoing the words from their wedding day. "But I can still lead you through life," Xavier replied, completing the familiar exchange. "And you can lead me right back. That is all we need." They danced until the stars came out, until the desert night wrapped around them like a beloved blanket, until they were ready to go inside to the home they had built and the bed they had shared for 30 years. And even after they stopped moving, even after they settled into sleep wrapped around each other as they always did, the dance continued in their hearts, the rhythm of a love that had started with a simple question outside a saloon and grown into something extraordinary. Eleanor fell asleep thinking about the scared young woman she had been, standing outside that saloon watching people dance and feeling so desperately alone. If she could go back and tell that woman what was waiting for her, all the joy and love and adventure that would come from simply saying yes when a kind rancher offered to teach her to dance, she would. But then again, perhaps the not knowing had been part of the magic, the willingness to take a chance without guarantees or certainties, to trust in possibility and potential rather than proven outcomes. That night, Eleanor dreamed of dancing, of moving through life held safely in Xavier's arms, of music that never ended and love that never faded. And when she woke the next morning to find Xavier watching her with the same expression of wonder he had worn on their wedding day, she knew that some dreams did come true, that fairy tales could happen even in the harsh reality of the Arizona desert, that love could not only survive but thrive if 2 people were willing to work for it. They had danced their way through 3 decades together, sometimes gracefully and sometimes stumbling, always recovering and continuing. They would keep dancing for however many years remained, keep choosing each other every single day, keep moving together through whatever life brought them. The sun rose over the ranch, painting everything in shades of gold, and Xavier and Eleanor rose to meet the new day hand in hand, still partners, still lovers, still the bride who could not dance and the rancher who had promised to lead her through life instead. They had kept that promise in every way that mattered, building something beautiful from nothing but determination and devotion, and an unexpected meeting on a summer night in Gila City, Arizona, so many years ago.